Every object absorbs, reflects, or transmits light in varying different amounts. And so if I take my little mini mag light here as our light emission source, and I shine it at my t-shirt here, which is very black, you can see that a large amount of the light being emitted by this flashlight is being absorbed by this t-shirt. However, if I shine it at the logo on the shirt, you can see that a lot more light is actually getting reflected now. It's coming back to you and looking as if though it's very bright red. And if I shine it at this piece of paper here, you can see that a decent amount of light is being transmitted through the paper. So at a surface level, we fully understand that absorption means that the light goes in and doesn't come out, reflection means that it bounces off, and transmission means that it passes through. But what does that actually mean? Well, first things first, calling it light might end up tripping us up a bit because there is so much more out there than our eyeballs can detect. So let's call it what it really is, which is electromagnetic radiation. And we can classify electromagnetic radiation by the wavelength, or the distance between the peaks in the wave. And there's actually a full spectrum of this, and it looks a little bit something like this. And the incredibly long wavelengths that can have peaks that are up to 10 meters apart, this fills out the radio and TV spectrum. But as those wavelengths get tighter and tighter down into 10 centimeters or 1 centimeters, we get into the microwave spectrum. Then we get down into the micrometer region where we get into thermal IR and infrared. And finally, we get into the nanometer region, and this is where visible light is. Within our eyeballs, we have rods and cones, and these are attuned to detecting different things. And for detecting color, we only have 3 detectors. And these are tuned to a very specific wavelength of light. And just by measuring the combination of the intensity of those 3 colors, we can come out with the full color spectrum. But you can see that this visible spectrum is just a tiny sliver of the total amount of electromagnetic radiation that's out there. And if our wavelength keeps getting tighter and tighter, we get into ultraviolet, then X-rays, and ultimately into gamma rays, which are measured with angstroms, which is an incredibly tiny distance. However, since my eyeballs here can't see infrared and beyond, or ultraviolet and below, let's stick with the visible spectrum for now. We're gonna dig into infrared a little later though. And here on the table in front of me, I have 2 items that I think perfectly represent the concepts of reflection, absorption, and transmission. This little case for holding all of my relay adjustment tools here is very clearly red, but what does red actually mean? And this adorable little slide rule here has this adjustable window on the front of it that if we pull it off and look through is very clear. But why is this clear and this red? Well, both of these things are built up of molecules and atoms. And atoms have a nucleus composed of a collection of neutrons and protons, and orbiting around this nucleus are electrons. And those electrons are electromagnetically bound to that nucleus. And that's a pretty stable configuration because, you know, the stuff on my desk isn't actively exploding in my face. But whenever the electromagnetic radiation from the lights in this room comes down and strikes these objects, it's actually trying to impart some energy into the object itself. Now, in the case of transmission, like this little piece of glass right here, the electromagnetic radiation from the lights doesn't actually interfere or interact with the electromagnetic forces that are binding the electrons to the nuclei in this substance. And because it doesn't interact with it, it passes right on by it as if though nothing happened, comes out the backside, and transmits almost perfectly to the other end. Now, the real world is dirty and not perfect, and this glass has all sorts of smudges and marks and whatnot on it that are actually catching a little bit of that light. However, whenever the light goes down and strikes this collection of atoms here, something very different happens. The electromagnetic radiation does actually interfere and interact with the atoms inside of this material. And when it does that, it imparts additional energy into those atoms. This gets them all excited and they start bouncing around and doing different things. Depending on the wavelength of the energy that is striking this, it can cause that atom to bounce around and bounce into other atoms, which bounce into more atoms. And all of that energy is being converted into movement of atoms. And movement of atoms is what we know as heat. So the light coming in is slowly warming up this packet in front of me. However, if every little bit of that radiation was absorbed, this would be like a black hole. But some of that energy is interacting with specific atoms within this material in a way that actually upsets those atoms. They get to a higher energy state, they realize they don't like that, they feel unstable, and so they kick some of that energy back out into the world in the form of photons. And those photons that are coming out are primarily within the red wavelength of the visible spectrum, which is why this looks red. It is absorbing all of the other wavelengths within the visible spectrum except for the red wavelength, which it reflects off of it like a mirror. Now, if we take our little mini mag light from earlier and we shine it at my hand here, we can see that there is quite a lot of reflection going on because there's a bright spot on my hand, but I can also feel that there's a bit of absorption going on as well because my hand is getting warmer at the point where the light is hitting it, meaning that some of that energy is being converted into the movement of atoms. But there's also a little bit of transmission going on. And we can actually see that if I take the light and I shine it on the back side of my hand around my knuckles here, you can see there's just a little bit of light punching through that's coming out in a very red color. What we've accidentally created here is a spectrometer. We have an emission source in our little mag light here. We have an object under test, my hand, and we have some detectors that can detect any light that is passing through the object that is being tested, otherwise known as my eyeballs. Now this is like a terrible spectrometer for a multitude of reasons, but one of them is that we don't actually know a whole lot about our light source here. Is it really white? I mean, when I look, I shined it in my eyes. When I look at it, it looks a little blinding, but also yellow. So maybe it's not a pure white. We can actually make our human spectrometer here a little more accurate by changing up the light source. And here I've built the world's worst flashlight. If I push the little push button here, you can see the green LED illuminates. And then if I push the toggle switch up and push the button again, now the red LED illuminates. As far as flashlights go, this is pretty terrible. But as far as emission sources for our human-based spectrometer goes, this is actually pretty good because the red LED and green LED are in pretty narrow but also widely different areas of the visible spectrum. So if I push the button here to get the red LED illuminated and I hold it up against my hand, I can see that red light is passing through. However, if I flip the switch, put it over to green, and I hold it up to my hand, I can't see anything coming through my hand that is green. So green is being fully absorbed or reflected by my hand, but if I switch over to red here, that is transmitting through my hand. So we've actually enhanced the accuracy of our human-based spectrometer here by improving the type of emitter that we're using. And I can actually hop online and find the data sheets for this green and red LED on here and figure out exactly what wavelength within the visible spectrum they're outputting. However, there is one fatal flaw with this human-based spectrometer, and that is the human. First of all, human eyes are atrocious. They're terribly unreliable, and the information that they put out has to be interpreted by a computer of some kind, the human brain, and the human brain is horrific. The worst computer on the planet. It will lie to you happily all day long. And there's proof positive of this because the human eye has a blind spot right in the middle of it. There's a space out here that I literally cannot see because that's where the optic nerve exits the eyeball. But my brain sees that blind spot and goes, well, it seems kind of strange to just not put anything there. And so it just makes a guess and fills that space in. So it could very well be wrong because it's straight up lying to me. My own brain is lying to itself. So if we want to do real deal proper science, we're going to need a better emitter, a better detector, and a proper computer. This is a Bomem DA3 Fourier transform infrared spectrometer. If our human-based spectrometer is a Huffy with training wheels, this thing is a Ducati 996R. It is the best of the best. And even though this one was built in about 1985, it is still one of the best high-resolution infrared spectrometers on the planet today. This is an incredibly special machine. Now, when I say that this is still one of the best high-resolution infrared spectrometers that you can find today, 40 years after it was initially built, I'm not saying that as hyperbole or for dramatic effect. This machine really is that good. Now, that's not to say that there haven't been advancements in spectroscopy. Of course there have been. 40 years is like a really long time. But it seems that the market has moved away from high resolution into middle and low resolution devices. And this is because, as I understand it, if you're doing wet spectroscopy, like working with oils, the amount of resolution that this thing can pump out is really not all that necessary. But this is still such a powerhouse of a machine that there are multiple institutions all around the world still using the DA3 today. And this particular DA3 is on loan from Mike down in Austin, who has a company keeping these machines going for those very institutions, which I think is absolutely amazing. So Mike, if you're watching, thank you so much for allowing me to get my hands on this machine. This is like really special and really exciting. But also, thank you so much for just teaching me everything that you have. The hours of phone calls that we've had and sitting down in your lab and seeing these things work and run has just been a really awesome time. And I am beyond excited to get this machine up and going. Which is to say that this machine is not currently functional. It's a ran when parked type of thing, but it's going to take a little bit of work to get it back up and going. And in order to understand what's going on here, let's get this thing pretty far apart. This little front panel here with all these switches and knobs on it just swings right open, revealing a pretty full card cage of a bunch of PC cards. Then there's a massive front plate here that is held on with 7 screws. If we take all 7 of those screws out, that just pops free and we are greeted with an absolute mess of wizardry and mirrors. Then there's this little plate on the top here. If we undo the 2 clasps that hold it on, it gives us access to where the object under test is gonna go. And then if we walk around to the back and take off the plate back there, we can see there is another whole mess of mirrors down there. We're in the thick of it now. This thing is absolutely stunning to look at. It is also stunningly complex. There is so much going on. I mean, we have a full wire-wrapped backplane with 5 cards that are filled to the brim with ICs implementing some pretty complex logic, and this mess of mirrors here is wildly complex. How on earth are we ever going to wrap our heads around how this thing works? Well, at the end of the day, it is still a spectrometer, so it's got to have some pretty basic fundamentals going on, and that is a light source, an object under test, and a detector. Our light sources are all right up here, the object under test goes in here, and the detector is right here on the front. So we have our foundation here. If we step through this thing one step at a time, we might be able to figure out exactly what's going on. Starting with the emission sources, we actually have 3 separate sources that cover a very wide range of electromagnetic radiation, from visible all the way to far infrared. And this little mirror right up here can rotate, selecting different sources. So you could put a single object in there and test it through multiple different sources by just changing out the detector. Now that mirror shoots the light straight down through this little 6-shot wheel here, and you can put different attenuators in there. It goes through an adjustable iris down here and shoots straight down into a different mirror, which reflects it back up into this very specially shaped mirror here that collimates it into a beam. This essentially takes all that electromagnetic radiation and smooths it out into a very uniform beam that it then shoots off towards this centerpiece here. And this is where the real magic happens, because this is a beam splitter. When that electromagnetic radiation hits this, half of it is reflected up into this tube, the other half passes straight through. Now in this tube and down here are two flat mirrors. The beams hit those, reflect straight back, and come right back into the beam splitter where they are recombined and shot straight down out the bottom. Once those recombined beams come out the bottom, they hit this mirror here, which is a steering mirror that can send it to the left or right side, so you can have two different detectors. And then it does a little bouncing around and shoots right back out the front. It passes through this little window here. The object under test goes right here in the middle, passes through the object under test, and finally into the detector. And we can actually see everything that I just showed by looking in the brochure here. They have a wonderful little diagram in here that shows the total path of the beam coming out of our source. So you can see it goes through a source selection mirror, the filters, the iris, bounces off a transfer mirror into our collimator. From there it goes to the beam splitter. That's this like magical piece here in the center that splits it into, sends half to a fixed mirror, half to a moving mirror. That's the one up here in this tube. They reflect back, get recombined by the beam splitter, come down through an output beam selection mirror, off of a flat mirror to a focusing mirror, through the sample, which is going to be right here in the box, and finally to a detector focusing mirror and into the detector itself, which is right here on the front. So like 90% of this is just steering and focusing the beam. But why do we have this wild piece in the middle here with a beam splitter and two mirrors that essentially just reflect it back to it? Well, there's one more piece here that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is that there's actually also a laser involved with this thing. And this nondescript looking black box is it. It says high voltage on it, and there's lots of warnings about laser radiation going on here, but if we take this top off very carefully, you can see the helium neon laser tube right here in the center. Nobody tells Styro Pyro, he'll make this thing handheld and use it to cut Coke cans in half or something, but this laser, aside from being beautiful, is absolutely essential to getting this spectrometer to work. So we have a beam splitter, we have a mirror and a tube that can move up and down, and we have a laser that will happily melt your eyeballs. Like, what on earth is going on here? This is far more complex than I ever could have imagined. But there are two big problems here that we gotta overcome, and these three things help us overcome those problems. The first is that our emission source up here is not outputting a specific wavelength, it outputs an entire spectrum. For the visible spectrum, the emission source is actually just a high-quality halogen bulb, which puts out a nice white light, but that white light covers the entire visible spectrum. Which leads into our second problem, and that is that our detector on the front here can't detect or differentiate between different wavelengths. It doesn't know if something is red or green or purple or blue. It just knows the total amount of energy that is striking it within the spectrum range that it can detect. And for this detector, that's the entire visible spectrum. So the helium neon laser produces an incredibly stable waveform, and we're using this for a multitude of purposes. If we imagine a sine wave that has a very similar frequency to the laser, every time we take a measurement, our measurement could land on the exact same place of that sine wave. And so we don't end up getting a good image of what that sine wave looks like overall. So we got to do some tricky stuff here to shift things around and get a better image of how that sine wave looks. And we do that with this beam splitter and the movable mirror. Now, as our emission source comes down and reflects through, it hits the beam splitter, and half of it passes straight through and hits this fixed mirror on the back. The other half of it splits and reflects upwards and hits this mirror in the tube, and this mirror can move. Now, if the two mirrors are equidistant from the beam splitter, what's going to happen is that beam is going to reflect back, strike the beam splitter, and recombine. And because they're equidistant, the sine waves all line up perfectly, and it just passes straight out the bottom as if though the beam splitter was never there in the first place. However, the moment that this mirror in the tube moves, the distance between the beam splitter and the mirror is now different between the two. So when those beams recombine, we're going to have a whole mess of waveforms constructively and destructively interfering as they move in and out of phase. Now, what I mean by this is that constructively interfere means that the peaks align and they become double, and destructively interfering means that the peaks are 180 degrees out and they completely cancel each other out. Now, if we move this mirror around willy-nilly without really knowing where we started or where we ended up or where it is in relation to the fixed mirror, this doesn't help us at all. It just creates an insane amount of chaos. So what we actually do is we send the helium neon laser through the same path as the collimated beam. So now we can measure exactly how different the two mirror locations are from each other. And if we know that distance precisely, using what we know about the multitude of waveforms that are coming through, we can figure out exactly which waveforms should constructively interfere and which waveforms should destructively interfere, and everything in between. And then we send this now jumble of mess through the object under test, and it goes into the detector, and we take that measurement. But because certain things are interfering and not interfering, we can actually ascertain a whole lot more information about the individual waveforms that we're seeing. But this raises one more problem, and that is that all of those individual waveforms are just in a big clump. It's all just being detected as raw energy here. This is where something called a Fourier transform comes in. And this actually has nothing to do with this machine itself. This is all something that is done in post-processing. And what a Fourier transform is essentially a pretty fancy bit of math that can take a finalized waveform and work backwards to deconstruct it and figure out the intensities of all of the individual waveforms that have been combined to make up that finalized waveform that ultimately we detected using our detector on the front. And this is a pretty wicked amount of math that isn't done on this machine at all. The raw data is just sent out to a computer that then performs the Fourier transform, which means that that computer has to be pretty gnarly. Now, if we flip through the brochure here, there's lots of wonderful information about the DA3 itself, but when we get to page 15 here, it actually shows the computer that they use, which is built into this really cool looking desk with a nice wood grain finish on it. And unfortunately, I don't have this desk, but the computer on the inside can actually be one of two machines. It can be a PDP 1173 or a VAX. But that's not the only thing. There's another board that is completely unique and built by Bomem called the HPVP board, or the High Performance Vector Processor. Now, if we go all the way to the back, they've got a few specs here talking about the High Performance Vector Processor. It can do data input rate at up to 200 kilohertz. I don't particularly know what that means. It does have co-adding memory, 840K 32-bit words. Again, I don't particularly know what that means. The computation speed is 5 times 10 to the 6th dot products per second. This is kind of a difficult thing to figure out what that means in terms of speed, but our rough guesstimate is that that means that this thing is doing about 15 megaflops, which is pretty wild. And then over here we can see that it lists the host system as a PDP 1173 with 1 meg minimum, 4 meg max, a 13-inch color monitor with 8 colors doing 512 by 240 pixels, an 8-inch floppy drive, and a 70 megabyte formatted Winchester drive. Fortunately, I have all of that. This is actually how I first met Mike. While the Bomem DA3 is absolutely still valid and in use today, the computer has long since been retired and replaced with far more modern stuff. But I'm a bit of a fan of old PDP 11s, and Mike wanted to see those 11s go to a good home, so he hooked me up with a bunch of parts that just so happened to be absolutely everything necessary to get a PDP 1173 hooked up to a Bomem DA3. In this admittedly unconventional case, there is a PDP 1173, 2 megabytes of memory, a Bomem DEB41 paired with a Matrox QRGB that give us the full color graphic capabilities, the Bomem DEB18 that interfaces with the vector processor board, and an 8-inch floppy controller as well as a Winchester drive controller. On the front here we have our 70 megabyte Winchester drive and our 8-inch floppy drive, and then on this side here we have the high performance vector processor. Once we're fully booted up into the operating system, it's just a pretty standard RSX11M install. We can type hello. It's going to ask me for my account or username. It's going to be Usagi. The password is Usagi. And there we go. We can do like a directory listing here, which there's a lot of stuff on this drive, so it's going to take it a second to list out everything in here. We can even do things like, say, show mem. This is going to show us what memory is being used currently by the system. I don't particularly know how to decipher this, so we're going to Control-C out of that. And the program that we're really interested in, though, is called menu. And if I hit enter on that, check that out. It's just so cool to see a PDP-11 drawing full color graphics like that. Now, this is the full system menu for controlling the Bomem DA3, but currently we don't actually have the DA3 connected up to it, so we're kind of limited in what we can do. But like I said, we do have quite a lot of files stored on the hard drive here, and some of those files are spectra that have already had all of the math and hard work done to them, so we can actually display those. So if I go over to DISP for display, one of those files is GL1VI1. I particularly like this file because I think it's pretty neat. So we'll just go ahead and hit return on that, and it's going to draw that spectra on the screen for us. Look at that. How cool is that? I love seeing that. So what is the actual game plan here? The Bomem DA3 can actually be controlled quite extensively with the front panel. So initially we're going to bring up just the DA3 itself without the PDP-11 connected to it. Make sure that everything is kind of doing what we expect it to do. Then we're going to get this PDP-1173 hooked up to it and controlling it, and try to get some spectra in the visible range and not under vacuum. Yeah, that's right. This entire thing can be pulled down to a vacuum of a couple of millitorr, and that's ultimately where we're going. I want to get a vacuum pump on this, the proper vacuum pump for it, and pull the whole chamber down to vacuum and continue doing measurements in the visible range at vacuum. And once we are sure that all of that is working perfectly, then we'll start to push into the near infrared range and the far infrared range. Ultimately using this DA3 and PDP-1173 combo to do real deal science just like it was 1985. I am unbelievably excited about this project, and I can't wait for the next episode where we're going to dig into this thing and try to get some electrons flowing through it. So I hope you guys are as fired up as I am about it, and I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.